Hello there and welcome to the Mythic Everbloom. My name is Tuskeh and in this video we are going to go over the Everbloom on its mythic difficulty, discussing what's changed, what hasn't, and offering suggestions for improvement during the public testing process. Before we begin, it's important to note that the content you are about to see is work in progress, and anything can change before this hits live servers. I really hope that some stuff does change because, in all honesty, this was the most disappointing of all of the dungeons. It's also the one we did first, but it was just really disappointing. So I was still setting up my UI as the first pack was pulled, so I didn't actually manage to hit record in time. But let's quickly go over what's going on screen now. So the Dread Petals, as per usual, don't seem to do anything. They just kind of melee hit the tank and can be AoE down. The Melded Berserkers actually seem fairly dangerous. They hit fairly hard, especially when they're buffed like that, and there's a lot of group damage going out, which is pretty cool. I have to say I like that. Interrupting the enraged growth from the Everbloom tenders is a good way to stop the Melded Berserkers from going crazy. And there are a few nasty debuffs that get thrown around, and you can dispel them fairly easily. As you can see here, occasionally I'm trying to put things on my action bars because my UI is a mess right now because of PTR bugs. But that really didn't stop us from doing okay in this dungeon. We had a pretty good tank in this dungeon, and even though they tried to get through the shortcut here, which I still don't know why that was ever a thing, but I think that there weren't really too many issues in this video. There was a weird bug as we continue up here. We won't be encountering it for a while, but actually the tornadoes spawned by the Treant mini-boss up there didn't actually do much for the first couple of spawns. But anyway, just moving on to the next trash pack here, we have the Dread Petals and some more of the Everbloom Naturalists. The Barrage of Leaves doesn't seem to be doing too much. As you can see, it's going onto the tank, not really doing any damage. And I know there are a lot of spells that don't really do much, and that's always kind of been the case in these dungeons, especially Everbloom, but it seems like there just isn't really much to think about here. It would be nice if there was a bit more damage going around, and really, as you can see, I'm spending more time sorting out my user interface than I am healing anyone right now. It really wasn't that dangerous. Moving on, we have some more Dread Petals, and then here comes the mini-boss. Now, this guy, Gnarlroot, he's called, isn't really that dangerous. You see the first time the tornadoes spawn in, they don't actually silence me, and I don't know if they silenced anyone else, but there wasn't any damage going out, and that was just kind of nice, actually. It was quite nice to be able to cast spells, but the next time the tornadoes spawn in, they do silence me, which is good to know that it's only slightly bugged. He also does that kind of breath attack that seems to hit fairly hard. We got a couple of ads here, but that wasn't really too much of a big deal, and I got a lucky Rune of Power here. As you see, I got silenced and I could just go straight into my rune. Again, the Rune of Power not supposed to spawn in these dungeons, I think, but it did by accident, I believe. That's probably just a PTR bug. But yeah, Gnarlroot wasn't too bad. He has that breath that hits fairly hard, but as long as he's faced away from the group, that's all fine. Not really anything mythic feeling so far. Then we have this Verdant Mandragora, which has that breath attack, which hit the group fairly hard, although after he did it for the first time, the tank kind of turned him away and we were all good. Wasn't too much of a big deal. As you can see, that Virulent Gasp doesn't hit too hard, but he doesn't really do anything else, which is a bit of a shame. Moving on, we have all of the trash before the first boss, Witherbark, and the tank actually pulled it all, and I panicked a little bit, popped a lot of my cooldowns, but really, this was the only time when things felt mythic. I mean, people were taking a lot of damage from getting focused by the Barrage of Leaves, but that was because there was about 7 of them going off at once. And really, that was the only time where I felt like anyone was ever in any kind of danger. And it's a shame that we have to pull so much to get that kind of mythic feeling. As you can see, I can keep the group up even through it, using some cooldowns and some good healing. So it would be kind of good to see if maybe just the damage went up in general. That would make it much more interesting. Now we move on to the first boss, Witherbark. Now, he is exactly as he is on Heroic, and no new mechanics, but we will suggest a few while we are here. Now, he hits at a decent rate, and he also has that Parched Gasp, which hits the tank pretty damn hard, which is good. I'm glad to see that deals a lot of damage. He's also got these unchecked growths, which just kind of speed towards you and then leave a kind of a void zone on the ground, so to speak. Just a bunch of I'm not even sure what it is. It looks like dust, maybe pollen. It does hit fairly hard, but not all that hard. You just move out of it and it's fine. He casts it fairly regularly, but then he becomes dehydrated. And I think it's a shame that so much of this fight is spent in this dehydrated phase. And I think it would be a cool new mythic mechanic maybe if when he was dehydrated, he wasn't stunned. Like, he still took extra damage, but he wasn't stunned. And I think that would be a kind of cool mechanic to make it a bit more mythic. But one idea I did have was for a new ability. Now, in the back of this room, you can see it just in the corner. There's this big kind of spring and a whole bunch of waterfalls and a little lake, or more like a pond. And it kind of flanks the western side of the entire room. And I think it would be cool if something was done with that, because that's where the water comes from. So I mean, I think it would be cool. I mean, you can also see that sometimes it fires these water bolts at people, although we didn't really ever feel it. What I think would be cool then is if this water created waves. Now, if you've seen the mythic version of Brackenspore, you'll know that he creates kind of a wave that's very dangerous. So it could be something similar to that. And you could have this wave that kind of goes through the room with a gap that you have to move in and to protect yourself from the damage. And it could also, every time the water went over this kind of big wave, every time it went over these unchecked growths, it could spawn them. So you'd have lots of these ads spawn at the same time, which would definitely be a challenge for the tank and the healer to keep in check while the DPS kind of cleaves them down. And it would pose the question, you know, do we focus Witherbark or do we try and keep these ads under control? And if Witherbark was also hit by the wave, it could rehydrate him completely and instantly, which I think would be quite cool, because then you'd have to think about his positioning as well as your own, with the whole idea that he continues to move while he's dehydrated. Now, he dropped an item level 6 30 piece here. We were all a bit confused by this, but I'm sure this item level will increase before this goes live. Now, after this boss was killed, our tank DC'd, or bailed, or something like that, and we had to find ourselves a new one. So about 10 minutes later, we find ourselves with a new monk tank, and I had to redo my UI all over again, but we got it all sorted, and now we move on towards the second boss, the Protectors. Now we have some Twisted Abominations here, which have that big AoE, which doesn't hit very hard, I have to say. I would expect that big kind of AoE to have like a massive knockback, or at least deal loads of damage, because you see the Enhancement Shaman got hit a couple of times here, and like he barely felt it. Compared to some of the other Mythic dungeons I've been doing, I haven't really felt like I've been doing much healing in the Everbloom, and for all these mobs having all these things like these triple attacks and these noxious eruptions and all that stuff, it just seems like the damage needs to be much higher, because it just doesn't feel like there's any kind of pressure on the group at this point. Moving on from there, we have some more Dread Petals and some Twisted Abominations and some Everbloom Tenders, and really this trash is just more of the same. It's not really that dangerous. We pull a lot of it here, and I use loads of cooldowns to try and keep this monk alive, because there's an awful lot of stuff going on right now, and I'd rather not wipe. So while this is all going on, I'm trying to find my Purify Spirit, put it on my bar, because everything's kind of exploding. My UI is all over the place. But still, even while that's happening, all those things attacking the tank, and nothing really happened to it. If that was something like a challenge mode, it would be hurting a lot more. I do understand that Mythic is supposed to be in between challenge mode and heroic, but this is leaning a bit too much towards heroic, I think, because it's just far too easy, unfortunately. There's not enough damage there, and it might just be because the tank was amazing. I didn't feel like they were a particularly incredible tank, but they just weren't taking much damage, and the group wasn't taking too much damage either. I'd like to see more raid damage coming out. I'd like to see just more stuff like that going on to make this trash actually more interesting. So moving on, we have a couple more waves of Dread Petals, and then we get to the Protectors. Now, this is a council fight made up of Dulhu, Earthshaper Tilu, and Life Warden Gola, and the damage here was pretty high, I have to say. I was impressed by just how much damage was going out. The Nature's Wrath from Earthshaper Tilu hit very hard, and I was constantly getting yanked around and stuff like that, and I felt like I had to use a lot of cooldowns to keep the group going here. It was very intensive, and I like that. I like the amount of damage going out, which is great. That felt very Mythic. It feels like this fight is Mythic in terms of damage, but not in terms of design. Because although there's a lot of stuff going on, you've got Earthshaper Tilu doing his Nature's Wrath, putting down the bramble patches, you've got Life Warden Gola doing his water bolts, and doing revitalizing waters, and increasing the haste of his group mates, and then you've got Dulhu, who's running around, making noxious explosions, pulling people to him, doing slashes. So it's a pretty intensive fight, and there's a lot of damage going around. But I'd just like to point out, first of all, that I did this in my elemental gear, which had no spirit. So, even though I was going pretty hard, I didn't run out of mana. And second of all, I think that this fight does need something new to it, something that could be really kind of awesome, and I came up with kind of a little idea. So let's say you get one of them to 50% health or something like that, or maybe like a couple of minutes into the fight, they enter a different phase. Now in this phase, they could all kind of run to the center of this kind of area where you fight them, and they could all do a specific ability, and maybe it lasts like 30 seconds or something, or maybe you have to deal a certain amount of damage to them or something like that. But the whole idea is that they'd all kind of be together, like all facing different directions, and Dulhu, the big one with the big orc, who's kind of the brute, would just be constantly pulling people towards him. And maybe he could have like and constantly casting that noxious eruption around him as well, so that you kind of have to make sure you're near him but not too close. And that would be incentivized by the fact that Tilu, Earthshaper Tilu, could be doing bramble patches in kind of circular patterns around the room, kind of like Lightning Storm on the Protectors of the Endless in the Terrace of the Endless Spring, kind of like having certain sections of the room made dangerous by bramble patches, and you have to move around to avoid it. And added on top of that, you could have Gola, the Life Warden, creating a kind of frontal cone of water, like a torrent of water in front of him, that slowly moves in like a circle. So you'd have to be moving around them, while also staying at certain distances and being pulled like, in at the same time. Maybe it wouldn't be a very particularly strong pull, but it could just be kind of like something that you have to fight against, and so you can't just stay still all the time. So that might be very interesting, just to add. I think that I might have gone into a bit too much detail there, but really, there should be some kind of second phase or some kind of new mechanic that involves them doing stuff at the same kind of time. That was just my idea. Now, moving on, we have this pathway leading up to Zeratak's den and this large infested spider here, the infested Venom Fang. Now, this fellow doesn't hit very hard. He, again, feels like it's on Mythic. The damage doesn't feel like it's been scaled. The tank takes, at least the tank's health moves, I'll give it that. And it does this Spore Breath, as you can see here, that hits the mage, I think. Yes, and also hits the tank, but the mage barely got hurt, and the tank didn't even get hurt by it. So that Spore Breath should be hitting much, much, much harder. It should be dealing loads of damage. And then we move on to Zeratak. Now, this fight is very disappointing. It basically just feels like a copy and paste of Heroic. The numbers aren't even all that high. There are a couple of moments, but they're not really that dangerous. So you see, to start off the fight, someone actually gets hit by Zeratak's kind of cleave ability there, and it barely hurts them. That thing should be a one-shot, in my opinion. But really, the main problem with this phase is that there's very little to do. You just have the ads, you kill them, then you wait for the next wave, and then you kill them, and there's no real intensity to it. So I've had an idea for a new mechanic. Have 2 bosses. Really is that simple. You could have it be like a 4-phase fight, where in the first phase, you fight one of them that's not on the web, that's on the ground with you, one of them who's up on the web, and then they swap positions, and then they do that twice. So you could get one to 50%, they swap, you get the second one to 50%, they swap, you kill the first one, swap, you kill the second one. So that would make sure there's a boss involved in the fight at all times. Because Zeratak is kind of like the mother of the brood, you could have maybe like... I know that it's not really kind of realistic, because that's not how spider kind of society works, spider society. But you could have a male version, you know, or just like a clone of some kind. Anything. I mean, it's World of Warcraft. You could explain it however you wanted. The idea is have 2 spider bosses instead of 1. And then you could basically just have the fight go on like that, except you have ads spawning at all times, and it would just be much more intense, because you basically need to double the intensity of this fight for it to even be a challenge, because this is the easiest boss, in my opinion, of all of the heroic ones. And even now on Mythic, it barely feels like anything. And there's no intensity to it. It's very boring. There's just nothing to it. So doubling the intensity by adding a second spider boss, I think that would be amazingly cool. So moving on, we leave Zeratak's lair, I get my mount onto my action bar, too late, and we head towards Archmage Sol. Now our tank decides to go balls to the wall here and pull everything, which makes this very, very intense. And you know what's crazy? We still live through it. I pop all of my cooldowns and it's very dangerous, and I think we do lose someone, but we do survive. We do not wipe. And I just want to start by saying that that should not be the case with all of these things. The damage should be so high that if you pull more than 2 packs at once, you should die, especially on Mythic. I mean, doing this on challenge mode would have you annihilated, I would imagine. I mean, granted, I haven't done it on challenge mode, but, I mean, with the damage being as high as it is here, although not nearly as high as it should be, you'd think that on challenge mode and maybe on Mythic, this would destroy you. Granted, we have a good tank, and I like to think I'm a good healer, and actually, just here I get stunned, but even though I get frozen by this, no one dies, and really, that should not be the case. I think these different mages and the spore images they make are fine in terms of mechanics. The damage just needs to go up. And then the tank even goes so far as to pull the boss while we are still fighting the rest of her lackeys, and the fight against Archmage Sol begins. Now, I believe there may be a slight change that I've noticed. It might just be me, but it feels like the flowers that she puts on the ground, those kind of fiery things, they seem to come out much faster. That might just be me, but we ended up with several of them very quickly. But in any case, when it comes to Mythic mechanics, I mean, her mechanics are exactly the same as they are on Heroic. The damage is a little bit higher, but it's not too nasty, and it wasn't very intense. It was just a lot of burst, especially once we killed her trash before her. Now, I think what would make this fight interesting is to give her the ability to cast all of her spells from all of her different schools right from the start of the fight. Maybe you could have it, the spore images appear at, like, different percentages of her health. And I think that with the ability to summon the Blizzard and doing the arcane bursts and adding the fire lines on top of all of that, the fight would become much more consistently intense. And it would definitely feel very mythic, I have to say. So maybe some kind of variation on that, giving her the ability to cast all of these spells from the beginning of the fight. It would definitely make it very intense. As you can see towards the end here, there's just fire everywhere. It's very intense, and that's what it should be like, I think. Either getting there a little bit faster, because we nearly killed her by this point. That's really the last little bit of damage she does. Or just making it appear faster, or letting her do it right from the start. That's how I feel you could make that fight a bit more interesting. So after that, we have to wait for the Undermage to make his way up to this wall of vines, and we will head towards the final boss, Yalnu. Now, Yalnu is just like he is on Heroic. He has the Colossal Smash that deals damage to the group, and particularly also deals a lot of damage and stuns anyone in the cone. Now, this is a little bit interesting because it looked a tiny bit bugged. A couple of times he'd face the wrong way while still casting it, but that's fine, that's not too much of a big deal. But really, this fight isn't too difficult, and he has all the ads, and he has the thing where he does the Genesis, and you have to stamp on all of the flowers to stop them from making ads, and if you don't, then you're in big trouble. But generally, this fight is made so easy, I think, because of the Kirin Tor mages that are helping you, and the fact that they kill all the ads for you and all that stuff. So this is my suggestion for making this fight mythic. Get rid of the Kirin Tor mages. Make the party have to handle everything themselves. Because really, when it comes to all the ads, you can ignore them. As a DPSer, you can just focus Yalnu, and it's not a big deal. So what you can do is, like, Yalnu appears at the start of the fight, he wanders through the portal, and then he does, like, some kind of big AoE that kills all of the Kirin Tor mages, and you have to fight him without the Kirin Tor mages there. So you'd have to actually handle dealing with the ads and AoEing them down and stuff like that. It would make the fight more intense, although it would get rid of some mechanics because the Kirin Tor mages are constantly firing arcane orbs off and putting fire on the ground, but really, you don't really have to do much to take advantage of that. They just help you, and you outnumber the boss and his ads quite dramatically. So I think that by getting rid of the battle mages, it would definitely make the fight much more interesting, because you have to handle everything yourself, which means you have to actually think about the ads and what they do, and not getting overwhelmed, as opposed to just, oh, put them in the fire and ignore them. So that is my suggestion for the mythic version of this fight. And really, it's a very long fight, and the bosses here have all seemed to have an increase in health, which is good. I'm glad at how long some of these fights take. And by the way, one other thing to think about when it comes to not having the battle mages there is they can't absorb the entanglements for you, which means that you'd have to think about that much more as well. So that would increase the difficulty of the dungeon. But that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.